Today we are finishing up this series that we've been in for the last 8 weeks called Run the Race. And Run the Race has been about Matthew 25, and it's been about Jesus' words as he gets ready to cross the finish line at the finish of his race that God has called him to run. And just before he crosses the finish line, he turns around and he sees you and I, and he says, you know, they're gonna need a little help. And so he begins to teach and share with us some resources that we need in order to finish our race well. Jesus does something that I think is just absolutely fascinating. What Jesus does is he has this really sneaky storytelling strategy so that we get to hear what Jesus is calling us to hear. And this is the way he does it. He tells 3 stories. And the first story is designed to kind of draw us in and get us listening. It's a kind of a surface level kind of story designed to just get us listening to what Jesus says. And so he tells the story of the 10 bridesmaids, and 5 of them are wise and 5 of them are foolish because some of them had oil and some of them did not have enough. And so at the end, Jesus says, hey, you know, the moral here is be prepared because the finish line is coming. Be prepared. And so all of us are like, yeah, Jesus, I'm on board with that, but we should be prepared. I was a Boy Scout. I get it, right? Be prepared. That makes sense. And so we're leaned in and we're listening to Jesus. And then he tells this second story. And the second story I call the get set story. And it's a story that is deeper and a little more challenging and causes us to think a little bit deeper and a little bit more. He talks about these bags of gold, that one employee gets 5 bags of gold, and one gets 2 bags of gold, and one gets 1 bag of gold. And the employees with 5 and 2, they go out and double the investment. And the master comes home and says, well done, good and faithful servants. But to the one who only got 1 bag of gold, the Bible says he was afraid, and so he buried his. And when the master came, all he had was what he was originally given. And this is where it gets deep for Jesus, because Jesus starts using language like, throw that lazy, worthless servant out into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And now all of a sudden, Jesus' audience is leaning in. They're listening, they're thinking, because what Jesus has just told them is that you have to use what you've been given because there will be an accounting. And then, once he's got us leaned in and listening, once he's got us thinking and wrestling, Jesus drops the truth bomb with the third story. He just drops it on us and says, drop some truth that we would never have been able to hear had we not listened and worked through those first 2 stories. And he tells us it's not even really a story anymore. It's really more of a truth or a promise, maybe even a warning. Jesus said the King, God, will bring all God's people in front of him, and he will separate the people, some on the right and some on the left, like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he'll say to those on the right, welcome into your Father's happiness. Because when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me a cup of cold water. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me in. When I was naked, you clothed me. And when I was sick, you cared for me. And when I was in prison, you visited me. And the people on the right are like, well, thanks, Jesus. We appreciate that. But when did we see you there? When did all that happen? And Jesus said, whatever you did for say it with me, the least of these, you did for me. And then he turns to those on the left and he says, away from me, I don't even know you. Because when I was hungry, you didn't give me anything to eat. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me anything to drink. When I was a stranger, you didn't welcome me in. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. When I was sick, you never cared for me. And when I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And the people on the left are like, whoa, time out here, Jesus. When did we see you like that? And Jesus reminds them, whatever you didn't do for the least of these, you didn't do for me. Now, last week, as we looked at this story, we wrestled with the why. The why should we feed the hungry? Why should we care for the sick? Why should we visit those in prison? And the answer simply is Jesus, right? Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me, Jesus says. And if Jesus is our why, then nothing else matters. Well, today I want to look at the how, because I'm guessing that if you really understand what Jesus is saying, if you really get the dramatics of what Jesus has just done, if you really understand the picture that Jesus paints of God bringing all people in front of him, and some are on the right and some are on the left, some are sheep and some are goats, I'm guessing every person in this room's question is, how do I avoid being a goat? Right? Right? You don't want this. Nobody wants that. That's no good at all. So what does it look like? How do I do this in my everyday life? How do we feed the hungry? Does it mean I need to give a cheeseburger to every person with a sign on the corner? Is that what Jesus is saying? How do we welcome the stranger? Do I just pick up every hitchhiker I come into contact with? I wouldn't suggest it, right? How do we visit those in prison? I don't spend a whole lot of time in Alcatraz. I don't know a whole lot of other prisons, so I just chose that one, right? And, by the way, where are all these naked people that Jesus is talking about, right? Because I don't run into them over at Speedway, right? I don't know how to do this. And so here's what I want to do today. I want to spend just a couple of minutes looking at these areas where Jesus said, here's what I want you to do. And see if we can find out what it really means for you and I here today, 2018, Delhi Township, to feed the hungry, to give the thirsty a cup of cold water, and the rest of the things that Jesus is calling us to do. So the first thing Jesus says is, I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. Now, the good news on this one is we could probably just take this one at face value. Because the reality is there are hungry people everywhere. There are hungry people, and I don't just mean I'm waiting to go to Cracker Barrel, right? I mean truly hungry people, people who are in danger because of hunger. 1 in 8 people in America struggle with hunger. 1 in 8. That means there are 10 people in this room right now who are struggling with hunger. Over 45 million people are considered food insecure in the U.S., and it's in every single county in America. 1 in 6 children don't know where their next meal is coming from. And over 6 million Americans over the age of 60 are food insecure, meaning they're trying to make the decision between food and medication. So when we talk about Jesus telling us to feed the hungry, some of that's pretty easy, right? It's pretty clear. But I want to invite you to go a little deeper, because I'm going to suggest that even the well-fed can be hungry. Let me say that again. Even the well-fed can be hungry. And I'm guessing there isn't a person in this room who hasn't been hungry on some level, a point or two in your life. Maybe some of you are relationally hungry. You're so lonely you feel like you're starving. Some of you might be emotionally hungry, just in a need for someone to speak life into you. Some of you are financially hungry. Some of you are spiritually hungry. This is why Jesus in the Beatitudes says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst, not for food, but for righteousness. So how do we feed the hungry? Well, we could go around giving food to folks, and I think that's a good plan, at least to start with. But I'd like to suggest that there's a difference between a handout and a hand up, right? You know, if you've heard the old adage, give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, teach a person a fish, you feed them for a lifetime. A handout is giving somebody some food for the refrigerator. A hand up is asking why the refrigerator was empty in the first place. What is the system that's broken that caused the refrigerator to go empty? What are the relationships that don't exist? What are the tools that need to be taught? What are the resources that need to be put together so that the refrigerator doesn't go empty in the first place? So my challenge to you today, if you're asking, how do I feed the hungry? I want to challenge you to think about it on two levels. Not just hand out, but hand up as well. Jesus said, I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. Now, I love this concept in the Bible because thirsty does not mean what we often think it means when we talk about being thirsty. When we talk about being thirsty, we're like, I could use something to drink, maybe a bottle of water. I'll go to the kitchen, we'll go to the refrigerator. There's always something to drink near us. And so when we think about Psalms like Psalm 42, right, David wrote, as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul longs after you. It's beautiful, isn't it? And don't we kind of picture this babbling brook and this beautiful, Thomas Kincaid kind of painting kind of deal, and it's all nice? But the reality is that that's not what David had in mind when he wrote Psalm 42 in the first place. David wrote Psalm 42 in the middle of the valley of the shadow of death, where there wasn't a stream for 100 miles. The reality that when David wrote this psalm, he was saying, I am dying of thirst for God. Thirst in the Bible is a term of desperation. Now I want you to picture a deer in the middle of the desert that has absolutely no resources, that couldn't barely take another step. And that's what David was talking about when he said, as my soul pants for you, God, like a deer pants for streams of water. Thirsty equals desperate. Anybody know any desperate people? I bet you do. Desperate people who have lost hope, who are in need of help, who are feeling lifeless. And here's the call of Jesus in Matthew 25. The call of Jesus is that all of us who are running the race, part of the race we're called to run is to bring hope to the hopeless, help to the helpless, life to the lifeless, to be the hands and feet of Jesus to those who have lost their way. Do you know somebody who's desperate? I bet you do. And if you don't, can I suggest you get out more? Because they're out there and they need you. They need you. Now, this next one is a challenge for me. Jesus said, I was a stranger and you welcomed me in. And on one level, I like to go to the, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, that kind of thing. But I think it's something different when Jesus talks about a stranger. And the reason this one is tough for me is because I'm beginning to realize that we live in an increasingly strange world. Can I get an amen on that? The world we live in is strange. And the relationships we have are even stranger. It's becoming more and more challenging as communities are polarized by politics or race or socioeconomics or ideas or 100 other ways we build these false walls to separate us from them. Our relationships have been sacrificed on the altar of Facebook friends and acquaintances so that we have lost the gift of deep and meaningful, transformative relationships with people. And neighbors have gone from being those people you could always count on to those weird people you live across the street from, right? Now, when I was putting this together, this part was exceptionally convicting for me. This is where I heard Dave saying, or God saying, hey, Dave, you're a goat in this area. When it comes to welcoming the stranger, you, Dave, are a goat. You know why? I've shared some of this with some of you. Every morning I get up, I leave my house, and I look across the street, and this is what I see in my neighbor's front window. It's a life-size mannequin of Donald Trump. Now, this is not Dave trying to be political. This has nothing to do with who you voted for or anything like that. And yes, he is wearing a halo. It has nothing to do with any of that. This simply has to do with, I find that strange. Right? And because my neighbor has a different way of living and thinking than perhaps I do, I have lived in that house for 4 years and never had an honest conversation with my neighbor across the street. I just have never done it. I've never done it. The stranger is not that person you're going to meet from another country. The stranger Jesus is calling you to invite in might just be that crazy neighbor of yours that you're uncomfortable with. Do you see how it gets real all of a sudden? So I guess my question to you is, who is your stranger? Who's your stranger? Because at the end of the day, as strange as that person is to you, you're twice as strange to them. Right? And all of us strangers need to find our way to get together. Jesus said, I was naked and you clothed me. Now, this was a hard one because, like I said, we don't run into a whole lot of folks. We go, naked. And I would suggest that if you find a naked guy over at Speedway, do something about it. Get him a jacket, buy, a towel. I don't know, do something, right? I'm not sure that's exactly what Jesus was talking about, however. When Jesus talked about being naked, what he meant was the vulnerable, the people who don't have protection or covering, those who are exposed. Those who are exposed and who cannot cover their vulnerabilities. I learned a lot about being exposed when I was in ministry in an inner city church in Dayton. It was a part of a multi-site church, and one of the campuses was up in an upper middle class, high rent neighborhood, and the campus I was serving at was kind of in the middle of a tougher neighborhood, similar to Lower Price Hill or something like that. And so I got a call one day that the local Christian school from up in the suburbs wanted to come down and spend a week doing mission work in our neighborhood, and I thought, wonderful. What a great opportunity for them, for the neighborhood. I thought it was great. So I invited them to come, and the first day they were there, they went out and did a prayer walk in the neighborhood. And while they were on their prayer walk, what happens so often in that neighborhood is something jumped off. Right? There was a domestic violence issue. 2 people came busting out of the front door of the house saying things that some of these Christian school kids had never heard before. It became violent and physical. The police were called. It was a whole ordeal. And so the leaders of this group gathered all the kids up and brought them back to the church. And they called me and they said, Dave, we're going to need to change plans. And here's the deal. We just figure it's too dangerous to take these kids out in the neighborhood. So what we're going to do is we're going to lock ourselves in the church. And for the next 6 days, we're going to do mission work inside the church. And I said, all right, I hear you. But here's the deal. We're a small church in the middle of the inner city. We don't have the resources to keep 40 kids, teenagers, busy for a week inside the church. And you know what happens when kids get bored? Stuff gets broke, right? And so I was just like, listen, if you're going to do that, if you want to lock yourselves in the church, then maybe you go back up to the suburbs and do it there, because we just don't have the resources to help you do that here. But before you make that decision, I said, let me suggest something to you. I said, I realized that what you saw today was scary. I realized that what you saw today was real. What you saw today felt dangerous. And what you saw today was very uncomfortable for you. I said, but let's be honest. If you think domestic violence is not happening in your suburban upper middle class neighborhood, you're insane. If you think alcohol abuse and opioid addiction are not happening out in the suburbs, you're not paying any attention. If you think danger and violence aren't around all the time, then you're not seeing through healthy eyes. And I said, the only difference between my neighborhood and your neighborhood is that your neighborhood has enough money to pretend it's not happening, to cover it up. I said, you make the decision. You do whatever you want to do, but I'd like to encourage you to stay. And I was proud of them. They did stay, and they had an amazing time. They got some of them got their eyes opened. Some of them learned some things about poverty and about relationships and about inner city ministry, and it was all good. But what it reminded me of was that part of the job of the church is not to stand here and judge those who are exposed, but to be able to offer them covering and protection and love. This is the hands and feet of Jesus in the world. And it's going to require us to check our pride, right? Because at the end of the day, underneath all of these pretty clothes, you're all naked. I mean, my speech teacher told me to picture all of you in your underwear. So I'm just saying that. But underneath all of this, we're all naked. And there but for the grace of God go I, right? Jesus said, I was sick and you took care of me. I was sick and you cared for me. And part of this means visiting in hospitals and nursing homes and that type of thing. But I want to challenge us to go deeper. Because like I said just a minute ago, opioid addiction and mental health are epidemics that are destroying our communities. And we don't pay much attention to them. We don't say much about these things because there's this stigma attached to them, right? We're like, well, if you were just smarter, if you were just better, if you just didn't take drugs, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we kind of have this mentality about people who are struggling with mental illness or with addiction. But I want to share with you a time where Jesus dealt with a stigma just like this. Matthew chapter 8 says, Jesus came down from the mountainside, and large crowds followed him. And a man with leprosy. Now let me pause there. Leprosy in that Jesus day was today's opioid addiction, was today's mental illness. It was that thing that you didn't talk about, you didn't touch, you didn't come near it. They were them, we are us, and you don't deal with it, and you probably have it because you deserve it. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus reached out his hand, check this, church, and touched him. And touched him. I am willing, Jesus said, be clean. Church, what would it look like for our hands to be the hands of Jesus that touch the sick? Not just that talk about it from a distance, but that touch the sick. And those we have this stigma around. Finally, and I want to leave you with this. Jesus said, I was in prison, and you came and visited me. Now, I'm a big fan of prison ministry. Kairos Prison Ministry, if any of you have ever heard it, I think it's amazing. They do great work with prisoners who are incarcerated. And I think that the church needs to pay some special attention to the boom of incarceration that is happening in our world. It's a big deal. It is a big deal. But there are more than one way to be in prison than just going to jail, right? I'm going to guess that there are people in this room today who are living in the prison of debilitating debt, right? I'm going to guess that there are people in this room who are living in the prison of unhealthy relationships. I'm going to guess that there are people in this room who are living in the prison of destructive habits or of fear and of guilt or anxiety, who are trapped by pride and selfishness and arrogance and sin. The reality is every one of us carries chains. The gift of Jesus. Jesus said, you once were a slave to sin. I have come to set you free. Isaiah 61 says this, the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. And so here's what I want to leave you with today, church. The why is Jesus. The how is up to you. The how is what does it look like for you to feed the hungry, to give a cup of cold water to the desperate, to visit the sick that nobody else wants to talk to. What does it look like for you to clothe the exposed and be a covering for them? Church, I believe at the end of the day, Matthew 25 Jesus is saying, this is what the finish line looks like, y'all. And if you want to cross the finish line, do what I did. Follow my path, and you will be blessed. So God, bless my sisters and brothers today. Teach us what it means to follow you, to do what you did, to love who you loved, to be where you were, to go wherever it is you send us. And God, help us to be your hands and feet in your world. In Jesus' name, amen.